welcome to another episode of my world-building series. This series is taking a look at a world I have been working on for many years now. It is a magical world that was originally inspired by a card game I had been creating at the time. Over the years, the lore of this world eventually outgrew my humble card game and became a thing unto itself. I did not begin writing this project with the intention of creating stories and characters from it. I was simply fleshing out a world for my game, and, as is often the case, my imagination ran far away with it, resulting in what we see today. Looking back at this project now, I am interested to observe how its structure slowly evolves over time, becoming less of a bullet-pointed documentary of information and more like an actual story. Ultimately, characters just popped out of this project organically, even though that was never my intention. The reason I mention this? Well, for those of you who are considering writing a story or a book, I advise that you perhaps try something similar to what I have done. Start with a world, then write a timeline of events within your world, and finally create some characters to inhabit your world. I have found this is the best way to create something cohesive, and, like I say, by the time I came to creating my characters, I had very little work to do. Today's episode begins section 2 of the project. This section shall be looking into the history of my world and documents humanity's progress through the ages. If there is a main character to this story, then it is not a person but a structure. For this great device sits at the center of events, both literally and metaphorically, for much of mankind's long journey. The structure I speak of is called the Arcus, and its complex story shall unfold over the course of these next few episodes. This episode shall begin our story in the ancient past, many thousands of years from modern times, and shall tell of the people and events of those times. Section 2. Timeline. Episode 5. The Ancients. The arcs, the realms, the great layers of reality, the endless infinity of raw magic and the bottomless void. These are truths that the ancients before us knew well, for they existed in a golden age that had lasted countless centuries, and their great cities marched endlessly across their world. It is believed that the ancients did not utilize magic as we do today. Rather than channel the arcs through their own bodies, they instead crafted great mechanisms and devices able to perform unimaginable feats of spellcasting. They imbued many of these devices with great consciousnesses so that they may better perform at their tasks. It is believed that the world of the ancients was maintained and run by a myriad of these creations, allowing the ancients themselves to indulge in whatever interested them. This time is known as the First Age. It was not really the First Age, but whatever lay before has now been lost in the fog of history. The First Age was split into two eras. The first, called the Golden Age, or Golden Era, which lasted many hundreds of years, and the second era of the First Age called the Great Departing. Little is known regarding the people of the Golden Era, and few of their great consciousnesses remain. Much of what we now know about humanity during the Golden Era has been gleaned from studying their structures and artifacts, of which there are a great many. The people of that time commonly built gigantic structures that rose imposingly into the atmosphere, or sprawled out over kilometers of land. It is thought that they lived within some of these colossal buildings, while others functioned as infrastructure, regulating and maintaining their empire. Ancient humanity possessed advanced knowledge, and a large quantity of their creations have survived the thousands of intervening years until today. Many of these artifacts are devices that are beyond our current technological understanding. Some still function, even after all of the hardships that history has thrown at them. However, few are able to successfully operate these ancient technologies, or even understand their purpose. What we do know is that at some point, far into the ancients' own history, their ancestors had mused about the mysteries of the night sky. And so they had sent a host of devices into the heavens to explore and discover these mysteries for them. They had sent many millions of their mechanisms, an entire ecology that was designed to thrive and evolve in the harsh conditions of space. Over 1,000 years later, these creations finally returned. In the intervening time, these mechanisms had evolved greatly, surpassing even their own creators in both knowledge and experience. These machine gods settled around the ancients' world in dizzying abundance, and there was much celebration for the reunion. This event could be thought of as the end of the Golden Era and the beginning of the Great Departing. The machine gods told many tales of their discoveries across the depths of space. They offered to take the ancients to these wondrous places and share with them the distant mysteries of their realm. Most of the ancient civilization accepted this tantalizing offer, And after a period of final celebrations that is said to have lasted 100 years, the machine gods departed the world once again, taking with them almost all the ancients, as well as a great many of the consciousnesses that governed their civilization. Towards the latter part of the Great Departing, the ancients built many monuments across their world. One of these monuments was crafted by a now unknown ancient, although they must have been an eccentric genius even in that time of wonders. It is even suspected that the creator, or creators, as it is often argued that this monument could not be the work of a single person, must have received help from the machine gods, or perhaps, it is sometimes suggested, it was the work of the gods themselves, for the structure of this monument, the complexity of it, the sheer audacity of it, is far beyond any of the rest. I speak of the Arcus, perhaps the most important structure in all this layer's realms. Like I have already mentioned, the arcs of magic do not get along with one another. This is rather an understatement in most cases. Most spells are cast from only a single arc of magic. Attempting to weave a spell from two arcs of magic is an insanely intricate and complex task and will most likely lead to the formation of instability bridges. These instability bridges will quickly spread and destabilize the spell, almost always leading to a complete breakdown and sometimes catastrophic consequences. Add a third arc into the cast and the dangers are magnified exponentially, and so on. Some of the ancients' mighty mechanisms were able to weave spells using more than a single arc, but this was extremely dangerous. These mechanisms also often required a high-level constructed consciousness to operate. Most of these consciousnesses joined the machine gods in the Great Departing, leaving their world a collection of abandoned husks, bereft of life and unable to perform their former tasks. The Arcus, however, is a monument to humanity's ability to circumvent the rules when required. The Arcus draws not from one arc, or two, or even three, but this device draws from a total of 6 of the arcs of magic. It not only weaves a spell from these 6 arcs, but the intrinsic strength of each arc is greater than they should be in this realm, by many orders of magnitude. To say it another way, the Arcus somehow draws more power than there is available. It weaves a spell that is not possible, defies the rules of reality. The Arcus pulls more power from each arc than should be possible, and then somehow weaves these arcs together within its core, to produce an aura of incredible power. It then emits this aura back out into the world like a beacon to the ancient superiority. Even after the machine gods departed the world, taking with them almost all of the ancient civilization, the Arcus continued to emit its great aura. It stood, unchanged as the first age of mankind ended, and the second age began. The Second Age. After the Great Departing began the Second Age with the era known as the Quiet Time. Almost all the great consciousnesses of the previous age had now departed the world, and of those that had decided to remain, most went into deep slumbers, an endless hibernation where they could indulge in their own private dreamscapes. Most of the ancient civilization had also left, but not all. A few had remained, for whatever reasons they chose. They roamed among the lonely abandoned structures of their once bustling cities, now still and silent monuments to a previous greatness. Interactions were rare considering the empty swaths of distance they traversed. Society had also departed with the machine gods, and anarchy reigned supreme in the Quiet Time. Those that were left were bound by no rules and could do whatever they pleased in this new world, although many of the things the ancients had become reliant upon had now ceased to function, and the priorities of those that remained often shifted to simply surviving. Some of the ancients had remained to pursue research projects, still unfinished at the end of the Great Departing. Others had simply refused to join the machine gods on their journey, and others had stayed to indulge in things that would otherwise be frowned upon by their peers. A few hundred years into the Quiet Time, and the endless cities of the ancients had slowly begun to crumble, and nature was busy reclaiming the world. A great many of the ancient structures still stood, for they were often colossal constructions, looming like giants. But the ravages of the weather, time and nature had had a noticeable effect. The people of this time had grown into many isolated groups of humanity, spread across the vast empty cities. Most of these groups had formed into what were known as lineages, groups that were all bound by their genetic inheritance to a founding member, and usually a core belief or mission. The ancients before them had stabilized their genetics so there was no danger in breeding with close family members, or even their own children. It seems that the ancients of the Quiet Time did not regard these practices as taboo, and small groups of founding members who shared a similar ideology would begin to reproduce their numbers. A few hundred years later, these groups had grown into the lineages that dominated the social norm of that time. Lineages were often quite insular, many possessing technology keyed to their own genetic signatures so that other lineages were unable to use them. Many lineages followed core tenets set down by their founders, or continued work on great projects or lines of scientific or philosophical discovery. They often kept their secrets to themselves, and although the lineages often interacted with one another, it was always with an air of veiled caution. Lineages ranged in size, from only a handful of related members to enormous groups containing hundreds of members of extended family. One lineage of that time had decided to study the mysteries of the Arcus, which still stood, as if untouched by time and the elements. The Arcus still emitted its mighty aura, which blanketed the entire planet with its power. The founding members of this lineage were puzzled by the many mysteries surrounding the Arcus. They had dedicated themselves to studying this strange monument from a bygone age. Their lineage had grown to an average size of around 100 people by the latter portion of the Quiet Time. But what they had uncovered had elevated their group to become the most important and powerful lineages of the time. This lineage were named Archivists and had claimed the lands surrounding the Arcus. Their founders had chosen wisely in their mission, for the Archivists had uncovered wonder after wonder while studying the Arcus. To begin, they had studied the aura of power that emitted from the Arcus. The power it contained seemed almost limitless, and soon they had designed devices that drew their power from this aura and did not require their own energy supply. This technology became extremely popular, and by the late stages of the Quiet Time, it had been adopted by almost every lineage. The Archivists also discovered a way to encode information into the aura, so that they could access it from anywhere almost instantaneously. This again became the social norm towards the end of the Quiet Time. The Archivists named the aura the skein, for it covered their world like an invisible net, allowing them to communicate with ease across vast distances. The skein became an integral part of society, powering almost all technology of that time, as well as acting as the main source of information storage. But it was the next few discoveries made by the Archivists that pushed humanity further along its story, and into the second era known as the Great Seeding. The Archivists began to study the Arcus itself, for they did not initially understand how it was able to draw such enormous quantities of energy from the arcs. They had calculated that the energy emitted throughout the skein was greater than the entire theoretical potential of their realm, which made no logical sense, and yet, the skein had radiated from the Arcus for hundreds of years. It now powered their entire civilization and had fueled the technological progress of ever smaller and more powerful personal devices. The truth of its existence was undeniable, and yet it defied the very rules of reality. Slowly, they began to uncover the truths surrounding the Arcus' fantastical construction. Progress had been slow at first because the Arcus seemed a completely solid structure with no internal spaces, no access points, and no obvious ways to interact with its systems. With much time and study, the Archivist learned that the Arcus was more than just a simple three-dimensional structure. It was the three-dimensional protrusion of a hyperdimensional object, existing mostly outside of our normal space. The results of the Archivist's studies suggested that the overall structure of the Arcus was vast. In time, they learned to manipulate the surface of the Arcus, so it seemed to slide around in seemingly impossible ways. After much manipulating and searching the surface of the Arcus, they discovered a way inside. To their delight, they found that their predictions were true. The internal space of the Arcus was a sprawling complex of endless shadowy corridors and dark cavernous spaces. Their explorations revealed that the Arcus possessed no governing consciousness, but was still a mechanism of mind-boggling complexity. Its components were intricately connected on a microscopic level throughout the entire space, built directly into its massive multi-dimensional superstructure. It was a device capable of amazing computations but lacking in any real intelligence, simply a hyper-advanced tool. As they explored, the Arcus began to reveal its truths to them, and it was more amazing than they ever could have expected. As the Archivists slowly mapped the internal space of the Arcus, they discovered further protrusions into three-dimensional space. Only not the three-dimensional space they were expecting. They discovered that the central portion and main body of the Arcus lay in some kind of intermediary space, along dimensions humanity is usually unfamiliar with. Around the edges of the Arcus were nodules radiating outwards from the central mass, and each one protruding into three-dimensional space. However, each nodule appeared to protrude into a different three-dimensional space, a different realm. Further study revealed that whoever built the Arcus had picked, very specifically, which realms the structure protruded into. there were 7 nodules around the Arca's central structure. One of these linked back to their own home realm. Each of the other nodules protruded into a different realm, and each of these realms had a different distribution of magic across its arcs. In each of the other 6 realms, one arc dominated over the others, taking a significant percentage of the overall potential. Eventually, the archivists solved the mystery of how the Arcus drew its power, or rather, where it drew its power. The entire structure of the Arcus acted like some kind of gigantic dimensional magnet. 6 of the nodules acted as receivers, collecting and funneling the ambient energies of their realm into the Arcus structure. Each receiver protruded into a realm dominated by a different arc. The Arcus then funneled these energies into its central core. The archivists discovered that they could not actually look within the core of the Arcus, for this action would destabilize its fragile balance. All they could do was theorize about what was going on within that fundamentally unknowable space, because the Arcus drew each of its arcs from a different realm, and each realm was dominated by a different arc. Their combined total potential was far greater than that of any single realm. This was how the Arcus could emit so much power. It harvested its power across 6 realms, and did so seemingly with a natural, almost osmotic effect that required very little input of power. Although it lacked an intelligence, the intricacy and craftsmanship of its design meant that it did not require one. Each subsystem ticked along automatically in perfect precision. It was a monument and had been designed thus, with longevity in mind. Its structure was composed of a substance unknown to the people of that era, but it seemed impervious to any damage or rigors of time. Its myriads of systems were robust and atomically precise, seeming to disregard the usual rules of entropy that plague all else. The energies from 6 realms were woven together in the Arcus core and then emitted through the 7th nodule to produce the skein in humanity's own world. This exploration and these realizations had taken the archivists a further 200 or so years, but they had learned and progressed much in this time. They had kept many of the things they learned to themselves, as well as keying much of the Arcus operational systems to their own genetic signature. By this point in time, their entire lineage had relocated within the structure of the Arcus. They had become knowledgeable in the secrets of multidimensional space, and they ruled over the great skein. Their lineage possessed the highest levels of access to much of their world's stored information. Then, one day, the archivists opened the Arcus to the other lineages, revealing their most closely guarded secrets. They announced to a stunned world that they were able to grant passage to 6 new, untouched realms. And with this, the quiet time came to an end, and the era called the Great Seeding began in earnest. The archivists' revelation of interdimensional travel sent shockwaves throughout all of human society, and many of the lineages became destabilized in the aftermath, as priorities realigned on every level. New lineages began to form in the first few years, whose sights were set firmly upon the new worlds and potential they contained. But the archivists were strict with access into the Arcus, and secretive regarding travel through its depths. Deals were struck and some were allowed through the Arcus, others were turned away. These new worlds were each very different, and often quite hostile to the human physiology. In the early days of the Great Seeding, the archivists formed close ties with another lineage called the biologists. This branch of humanity was focused upon the mysteries of genetics and the human form. Many of their numbers sported strange biological mutations and augments to their bodies. This lineage were masters of bioengineering, and they helped the archivists overcome many of the environmental issues preventing travel into the new worlds. Humanity went through a period of history where they made several genetic modifications to themselves. Many of these modifications have survived today. Modern humans are resistant to extreme temperatures, as well as most forms of radiation damage. We can eat and digest a huge variety of food and drink without any ill effects, and are hardened to all but the most virile of pathogens and poisons. The biologists were the first lineage, along with the archivists, to set foot upon the new worlds. Following soon after were the monumentalists, a lineage that crafted and maintained great artistic works. This faction held secrets regarding material engineering and were masters of construction. The archivists solicited their help in building the infrastructure for the first colonies. The architecture of this time was very different to the colossal buildings of the First Age. The monumentalists favored smaller structures with sweeping designs that were aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Their art focused around a simple, functional elegance. And this architectural style quickly became ubiquitous during the Great Seeding. Another problem that hampered progress into the new worlds was that the skein, that humanity had become so dependent upon was only emitted in their home realm and not into any of the other 6 new worlds. The archivists toiled long and hard upon these issues, attempting to solve the problems. Eventually, with the help of another lineage, they were able to circumvent some of these issues, but it is commonly thought that the modifications made to the Arcus during this time were the initial trigger to a chain of events that eventually led to the violent end of the Second Age. The archivists could not reproduce the skein in any of the other worlds. The Arcus was like a gigantic cosmic lodestone, and the nodules protruding into the 6 new worlds were collectors, not emitters. This was part of the fundamental superstructure of the Arcus and could not be changed. Humanity had become dependent on the skein, not only as a power source for almost all their technology, but also as the main means of storing and retrieving information across their civilization. The archivists' first solve to these problems was to work with a lineage called the librarians. These 2 lineages had spent most of their history at odds with one another, for they each controlled their own vast stores of information. Back in the days of the quiet times when the archivists had first discovered how to encode information into the skein, the librarians were among the few lineages that did not quickly adopt this method of information storage. This lineage were dedicated to the preservation of information, especially the secrets of their forefathers, the ancients. They had spent their history documenting and collecting any data they thought worthy of preserving. They stored these vast collections of information in huge towers of their own construction, keyed to the genetic signature of their lineage. They powered these towers using an ancient technique, and so had no need of the skein. When most of the rest of the world adopted the skein, the librarians politely rejected the archivists' offer. This sparked a long-held feud between the 2 lineages, as they each held monopolies on their unique forms of information technology. The archivists ultimately won this competition as they rose to become the most influential lineage of their time. But the librarians still held many secrets of their own and remained a powerful competing faction throughout their history. Eventually, in the name of humanity, the 2 lineages set aside their differences and worked together to solve their mutual problems. The deal between these 2 factions was a simple one, possibly the only option that would ultimately work. Complete transparency on both their parts. Each lineage shared their secrets with the other, and only by working together were they able to overcome the issues plaguing humanity at the time. The librarians constructed their towers upon the new worlds to act as relays for the skein's information. The librarians interacted with their technology through a kind of telepathy, a remnant from the golden age of humanity. This technology was a closely guarded secret of the librarians, and while other lineages had similar ways of operating their devices, nothing was as advanced or refined as the librarians, not even the archivists. Through a combination of their mutual technologies, they were able to relay much of their information back and forth between the worlds. This allowed humanity to access the information contained within the skein, even from other realms, almost instantaneously. Communication lines were established across all the worlds, a huge step forward in humanity's progress. Eventually, the archivists also constructed a network of devices throughout the Arcus. This gigantic array was used as a conduit to funnel a portion of the skein's power back through the Arcus and into the 6 new worlds. With some small advances in the range of their technological devices, they were able to draw power from this array. The power produced by the Arcus array was only a fraction of the skein, but it was enough to power their civilization in the new worlds, albeit in a limited range around the Arcus. These 2 hurdles were the last ones standing in the way of real progress, and once solved, the archivists lowered many of the restrictions preventing travel through the Arcus. Around 400 years into the Great Seeding, there was a population boom, as a tide of humanity poured through the Arcus and exploded onto 6 new worlds. This population explosion signified the end of many lineages and a general movement away from that mode of society. Many new factions formed that were not bound to the same genetic inheritance, and the stark genetic markers proclaiming an individual's allegiance began to be washed away into the background of humanity's DNA. Some of the bigger lineages, however, persisted through these times and retained monopolies over their technologies. The 6 new worlds were each vast untamed environments, often hostile but mostly devoid of life. The lifeforms that were discovered in these new worlds were strange and unexpected, challenging humanity's concepts of what they expected life could become. The lineage of biologists had fractured into 2 groups, with differing central beliefs. One camp, now called the cartographers, wanted to explore these new worlds and learn about their unique forms of life. This group focused on making modifications upon themselves, wanting to leave the new worlds relatively untouched. The other camp, calling themselves the Crafters, had the opposing view, choosing to sculpt the worlds around them and fill them with a myriad forms of life, tailored to suit their new unique environments. The Crafters toiled endlessly in their labs, engineering new life forms to fill their corresponding worlds. Indeed, this act gave the era its name, the Great Seeding, as the Crafters scattered the seeds of life across the 6 worlds, life forms that have now evolved into what we see today. The cartographers, however, often left the safety of their colonies and ventured off alone on long missions of exploration, looking to find awesome new vistas of untouched wilderness and search for indigenous life forms, untouched and unaltered by the hand of humanity. The cartographers could not utilize many of the technologies powered by the Arcus array, and so they made further genetic modifications to their own forms. They were among the most durable of humanity's factions. It is thought that they made alterations to themselves, allowing them to see more of reality than their normal senses would allow. This allowed them to explore their environments more efficiently and thoroughly. They possessed augmentations to their genetics and specialized new organs to sense beyond their regular perceptions. It is believed today that these modifications were the foundations allowing modern humanity to sense and manipulate magical energies with such precision. The cartographer faction began life as a small niche group of like-minded individuals, but their genetic durability allowed them to survive the hardships of the Sundering and following Dark Ages and eventually thrive. The cartographers ultimately became the most successful branch of humanity. Almost all modern humans from any of the realms, excluding perhaps Danunkast, are related to this faction of humanity, and have inherited many of their genetic qualities. The latter portion of the Great Seeding marched on. Humanity flourished within the confines of the Arcus array, taming the wilderness, sculpting the landscapes and churning out a dizzying number of new life forms into the realms. While back in their home realm, the scattered lineages of humanity flocked to the Arcus, seeking adventure and intrigue in the 6 new worlds. Each year, the Arcus processed many thousands of people, and countless millions of packages of information back and forth between the 7 realms. It became a ceaseless flow, like a vast interdimensional heart beating out across the cosmos. The archivists and librarians had amalgamated over the intervening time to become the Archivarians. They continually worked to push the limits of the array, refining and modifying it to produce an ever greater flow of energy into the new worlds. The latter portion of the Great Seeding is commonly considered to be a second, albeit lesser golden age for humanity, where its numbers swelled and progress fueled various technological revolutions. Humanity rode the wave of these social and technologic highs, enjoying the many new wonders of the 6 new realms and reveling in the relative comfort of that age. It is quite possible that this heady hubris, carried by the people of that time, was a large contributing factor to their eventual downfall. They were too busy enjoying themselves to notice the signs, the cracks beginning to show. It is believed today that the people in the time of the Great Seeding had learned much of their knowledge regarding fundamental energies by studying the Arcus. However, the Arcus concerns itself with only 6 of the 7 arcs of magic, and it is commonly believed that humanity at that time thought there were only 6 fundamental arcs. They possessed no knowledge of the 7th arc, for it was the most elusive by its very nature. This fatal flaw in their knowledge was their eventual downfall. They were so busy exploring the worlds bridged by the Arcus that they never stopped to consider what that bridge was ultimately built across. The central body of the Arcus, containing the majority of its overall area, is built within the Arc of Sumas, for while the barriers of reality are imperceptibly thin, they are also all part of the same infinite arc, an endless void of darkness sitting between all things. The creators of the Arcus had designed its structure to be robust, but its balance across the realms was incredibly precise. It is believed that the various modifications made to the Arcus over time, and the continual flow of life and energy and information through it and across the void of Sumas, eventually tipped this fragile cosmic balance. A tiny inconsistency formed within the core of the Arcus and slowly grew there, unknown for hundreds of years. The Archivarians could not look within the core of the Arcus, for this violated the rules of reality, but they had studied the skein it produced for centuries and understood its energies well. By the time the inconsistency within the Arcus had grown enough to show itself upon the skein, it was already too late. Tiny instability bridges were beginning to form, fleeting and rare to begin. These patches of instability quickly began to spread like a growing darkness across the skein. No one had ever experienced its like before, and the people of that time feared this unknown absence of energy, spreading throughout the skein and the structure of the Arcus. They scrambled to understand what was happening, to stem the spreading darkness. But their efforts were in vain. Too little, too late. Their lack of knowledge and reckless use of the Arcus over their era proved their undoing. In a last act of desperation, the Archivarians attempted to shatter the Arcus connection across the realms, for they feared the darkness would consume the Arcus and wash out across all of reality. Fearing they were the instigators of reality's undoing, they attempted to break the Arcus' great link. Ironically, it was this act, not the burgeoning darkness of Sumas, that caused what is now called the Sundering, and brought a catastrophic end to the Great Seeding and the Second Age of mankind. Very few people know of the events surrounding the Sundering, for it was only a matter of a few hours from when the Archivarians noticed the darkness growing across their skein to when the Sundering occurred. The Archivarians spent this time in an ever-increasing panic and growing desperation. They did not take time to warn the rest of humanity. So, for most people outside of the Archivarian lineage, their first real sign of their impending doomsday was when the skein suddenly dropped. Only moments before a catastrophic explosion radiated outwards from the Arcus and raced through all of reality. It was not the darkness of Sumas spreading throughout the Arcus that actually caused any of this, however. The Arcus had become dangerously unbalanced over the centuries, and the system was attempting to rebalance this issue. The Archivarians did not consider this. The Arcus did not possess a governing consciousness, but sometimes a system does not need a brain to exhibit intelligence. The Archivarians did not understand this. For all the time they had spent studying the Arcus, the Archivarians still did not truly know it. All their attempts and efforts to stem the unknown void were fruitless. They were like children, trying to smother an inferno by throwing handfuls of sand at it. By the time they started to evacuate the Arcus, they knew it was already too late. Many of the Archivarians had broken down, either into blind panic or resigned apathy, and only some still kept their heads amidst the din of desperation. One Archivarian had suggested that the spreading darkness would not stop at the Arcus but would spill out, most likely into all 7 of the realms. This idea caught like wildfire, and soon everyone was whispering it. Even if there was a small chance of this happening, they had to do something to stop it. As time ticked away, and the darkness grew steadily across the skein, more and more outlandish ideas were suggested. Towards the end, it was suggested that someone look within the core of the Arcus. This, it was theorized, would destabilize the spell within and effectively turn off the Arcus. Despite the absurdity of this idea, it gained much merit at the time. There were even a host of willing volunteers, eager to risk their lives for the chance to look within the Arcus' ultimate secret. Only a few voices spoke out against this idea, highlighting the potential dangers of these actions, but they were drowned out by the excitement of the others. In the end, amidst furious arguments, it was decided that this was the only course of action to save the 7 realms from annihilation. This mistaken decision was the undoing of the Second Age of mankind and nearly caused the complete extinction of humanity. One Archivarian saw the folly of this decision. She had spoken out against the idea, but her voice had been drowned out by the chaos of arguments around her. Like many of her peers, she had spent her long lifetime studying the mysteries of the Arcus, but she was considered to be especially gifted at understanding the complex world of hyperdimensional space. When the others made off towards the core of the Arcus, she went another way, with an outlandish idea of her own in mind. She needed to understand what was going on, but the Arcus was a vast structure, housing many millions of subsystems, intricately connected together. There was no governing consciousness in the Arcus, not even a simple one. The application of sentient consciousnesses had been frowned upon after the days of the Great Departing, and the technology had finally become lost in time. The people of the Great Seeding could create very clever mechanisms capable of mimicking a semblance of intelligence, but the vast consciousnesses of old were beyond their current science. There was no intelligence within the Arcus, but there was space for one. Uploading a human mind was not something that was done in the time of the Great Seeding, but it was theoretically possible. In fact, some of the old Archivarian technology, inherited from the librarian lineage, utilized a similar process for communication. If she could jerry-rig the old equipment, make a few quick modifications, maybe she would have time. She knew that it would mean the end of her physical body, the end of her in fact, for the thing she would put into the Arcus would not be her, but a copy. But the copy would be her, even though it would immediately know it was a copy. To the copy, the transition would be seamless. To her, it would be fatal. She suspected, however, that when the others broke into the core, it would be the end anyway. While she furiously worked, she pulled as much data as she could from the failing skein into her own mind. Her head hurt, but she knew her copy would have space to spread out into. When the stream of raw data torrenting into her mind abruptly ceased, she knew she was out of time. She spent a final moment considering her husband, exploring far away in another realm. Somehow she knew he would survive what was to come. She knew it with a certainty that was undeniable. She smiled at that, knowing he would come for her. Together, they were unstoppable. With her next thought, she commanded the old device before her into life, thus ending her own. Her assumptions were correct, of course. The Archivarians attempting to look within the core never managed to do so. As soon as they compromised the containment shield, the power within flooded out, instantly vaporizing most of the room back into base fundamental energies and eating away most of the rest of the protective casing. The titanic powers within the Arcus core burst forth. The explosion that emanated from the Arcus was not a normal explosion. The shock wave of this explosion warped the very fabric of reality and shook the foundations of the entire Great Layer. This shock wave emanated from all 7 of the Arcus protrusions simultaneously, violating numerous laws of reality. 7 realms quaked and shivered sickeningly. The fundamental fabric of reality was violently shaken apart in the event now referred to as the Sundering. The 7 realms lost their cohesion and slipped out of phase with each other. Disconnected, they began to drift apart into the infinity of hyperspace. The immediate area for several kilometers around each Arcus was atomized in the initial explosion, but the shockwave continued to radiate out much, much further. Surprisingly, the Arcus itself remained intact, safe within the eye of its own multidimensional storm. Inside the Arcus, however, was another matter. The energies that spilled from the core sterilized the entire structure of all life. Almost the entire Archivarian lineage was wiped out in this single act, and with them died many of the Arcus secrets and almost all technology keyed to their genetic inheritance. This included their control over Arcus access routes, which had snapped shut moments before the Sundering radiated forth. The vast majority of the human race was concentrated into those few several kilometers of land surrounding each of the 7 Arcus, and the death toll of the Sundering is incalculable. Humanity was pushed to the brink of extinction in one catastrophic moment, and with the fall of the skein, mankind also lost almost all their collectively stored data, as well as the power source they had become so reliant upon. Far away from the Arcus, or indeed any civilization to speak of, the Archivarian's husband, a man from the cartographer lineage, watched in mute horror as the world before him ruptured. He barely had time to throw himself over the cliff he stood upon, before the shockwave raced to meet him. We will talk more of him later, for his story is integral to the complex web of history. For now we will say that he did indeed survive the Sundering, as his wife so rightly predicted. The violent fluctuations tearing through reality like tidal waves manifested into the worlds as catastrophic events. Mountains rose forth, seas boiled, fire rained down from the heavens. Earthquakes shook the land, while titanic sheets of lightning tore the sky asunder. These manifestations raged on chaotically for many years, and few survived the days of the Sundering. Much of the greatness of our history was lost on that day, and what followed was a time known collectively as the Dark Ages. These 2 ages tell the story of ancient humanity, a story that has mostly now been lost to time but is still significant even today. In our next episode, we shall examine mankind's journey through the Dark Ages and into the Third Great Age. I hope you will join me as we continue our trip through time. For now, thank you for your time and stay creative.